So, this is the church tour. Very briefly, I just want to talk a little bit about the church in general, and then we'll do a walk around. But I think one of the first things that smacks you upside the head when you walk into an Orthodox church is all of the things, really. It is not a plain space. It is very much adorned with images and fancy rugs and golden cloths and stuff. Fancy is maybe the way you describe it. But that's because this is not a lecture hall, nor is this a gathering space where we just hang out and have fun, right? The purpose of this space is to worship God. And if you read the Old Testament where it describes what the temple, the place where God was to dwell and where he was to be worshipped, should be like, well, it's rather ornate, is it not? Does anyone remember off the top of your head at least a few of the things that are called for? Yeah.
Altar?
Sure. Several.
Holy of Holies?
Several altars, yeah.
Candlelight?
Sure. And he was to have images painted all over. So, of course, this is a borrowed space, but I'm sure you've seen Orthodox churches before with iconography all over them. We didn't make that up. And if you remember anything about, say, the vestments that the clergy were supposed to wear, right? It's very meticulous about how they're to be prepared, what materials they're to be made out of. Fancy, right? We're the continuation of that. That's what we talked a little bit about last time. We'll talk a little bit more about in some of our subsequent sessions here. But this is the temple, right? We're worshiping in spirit and truth, not just in Jerusalem, but that's what this space is. This is equivalent to the Jewish temple. And so it's adorned quite a bit. Alright, I think that's good enough for an introduction. So let's go over into the entry, otherwise known as the narthex. Those of you that have taken this course before, what's the point of this space? Actually, before we get there, what is the thing that I don't put on here, but is technically still part of the church? I didn't put it on there, so you can look, it's not on there. Sure, I'll accept that. The porch. How many of you, those of you that have you will hear people use those words interchangeably, but technically speaking, they're different things. In some monasteries, you'll even see a second curtain. It almost looks identical to what you have in the iconostas here between the Orthodox and the nave. And you'll also see in the cycle of services in the full monastic rite that the service moves through the various spaces as you get closer to liturgy and communion up front. So, for example, Vespers may be done entirely out here because there's nothing to do in the altar. And then you'll see there's often sort of a raised dais and throne for the abbot to sit and serve the Vesper service from out in front of the closed doors and curtains of the rooms in the Orthodox rather than at the end of the nave. That is, I've never seen an Orthodox church in North America do that or move services. There may be some of the Catholic monasteries do that. Very good. Okay, that's the Orthodox.
So the rope doors is actually not old or Jewish tradition, it's more of an actual
Yes.
a new.
Just like singing the news over 1,000 years ago. Sure. Yeah. New thing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Into the nave. Why is it called the nave? Yeah, you're close. Something about the names. Remember more details than that? The saints talk about the ark of salvation, right? That's the church, and thus we call the space the nave after quote. So that is a very intentional word choice there. Sometimes you'll very broadly hear people refer to the space as the sanctuary. That's not really a word that we use in Orthodoxy much, but I think usually if you do see that, it's just kind of like all of it here. I don't know. You'll notice, of course, there's lots of stuff everywhere. Does anyone know? This church does not do it, but does anyone know what the rule is for the placement of icons in a church?
I know. Jesus.
That's good. Yeah. Which hints a little bit at one of the axes.
The Lord on the right side.
That's also true, but let's focus on the big dome of the Pantocrator. So one of the two axes for icons is you'll see icons of saints, often standing full body. And the higher up you go, it'll be angels, and then you'll have sometimes even like stars or something for the heavens, and then Christ the Pantocrator way up at the top. So you've got one axis, but literally. And then the other axis is from back to front, going towards the high place, which is, you don't even remember all that, it's just interesting. But placement of icons isn't random unless it is, which is the case in this case. And I think a lot of churches, a lot of these kinds of rules are the types of things that happen more in monasteries than in this kind of church where we're just trying to make it work. If we ever are able to build a dedicated space and hire an iconographer to make it all beautiful, then sure, of course, we go all in and try to do all that. But for now, we just try to make it as churchy as we can, and often that is through this type of icon, which is usually donated by people. So the community that comes forward just have, and then we put them where it makes sense. So we'll talk about the icons more in just a second. Again, we'll talk about this a little later, but since we have a few of you, well, all of you have been in services for a little while, what is the rule for prostrations? What is the day you're not allowed to prostrate on?
Sunday.
Except we just did it a few weeks ago. Yep, every other time you do not prostrate on Sunday, which means the rest of the days, you prostration. We don't do them as frequently now as we did in the past. I'd like to start doing a little more about weekday liturgies. And you'll see, at least, I don't know what the other people do, but I do a lot of prostrations up there through multiple parts of the service. There's quite a bit.
So, should we be doing a prostration every time you do?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
There's
just
a few times where
is that a good?
I can't because I have to do something and you all should. But yeah, if you see me doing prostration, you
Every
should.
yeah. That's just a good rule to have.
If we had a deacon, I think it'd be a little clearer because they would be out here for the most part. That would know so you could follow stand in the presence of royalty or whatever. So we stand in prayer, right? This is the temple we talk about, this being the temple where God dwells. So we stand in his presence. Also, I just talked about all the frustrations we use rather than you guys we so, of course, you do see them, but they are very much an American thing. Arrogant, obviously, used abroad. It's just a Protestant influence on some. Of course, I think you all know you can't say you can eat religion. All right, so icons. We'll talk more about them in general later, but I do think it's important to just remind everyone again that we are not worshiping the icons. We're passing on some veneration. We make a distinction between worship and veneration to the prototype in the image. So whether it's painting, whether it's print, doesn't really matter. It's an image of a holy person, and that holy person is only holy because they did what?
Because Christ made it.
Close. Because they lived the life of Christ, right? They did what his will was for them. Right? They got out of the way and they weren't doing their own thing. So by honoring them, we are honoring God because they did what God wanted them. And also as a reminder, if you have ever been to some of our weekday services, this is a rather well-attended one. Sometimes it's just me. Except it's not because we're surrounded by all the things. All right, so let's take a moment and just look at the icons in here. We have the Theotokos over there. We've got a bunch of different versions of the icons of her. At least one of those, I think, is like a very Polish icon, one with a big crown. But there's a bunch of ones. You'll notice on top we have these big ones all around. Hopefully these are somewhat identifiable. Do you know what they all are? There you go. Yep, all the Gospels. And then in the straight back, we have the North American saints. In the back of the choir here, we have some choir saints. Does anyone know what these are? These are saints for every month. So it's the same that we have in the middle right now. There are iconographers that will go and say, you know, on this day we celebrate this person, and so it's just a big old crowd of everyone by date. And so we put them out for the weekly services for whomever we're commemorating that day. I don't actually know the story of who these are or why they're here. These, however, are all the founders of this parish. So take a second and just go around and look at them all. Ask me if you have any questions. Some of these are very historical, like the icon made without hands, or some of our ones up front on the stands. But go ahead and take a look at them a little bit. Take a few minutes to. My smallest child, Cyril, he really likes the one with the pile of the disciples. He calls it the EE icon because all of the disciples are sleeping.
He said the founders are all this one, so what exactly is it you mean by the founders?
Patron of someone was St. Antonius, patron of someone else was St. George. Yep. So this isn't these saints aren't related by any particular theme like being from North America or all of the most of the scenes. These are just the founders. There is an interesting one at the top there, the top right, is the icon of the martyrs of the Boxer Rebellion in China. Each icon gives.
Is there usually an area dedicated to Orthodox?
Not really. Other than, so usually if you have a larger ceiling than we have, you would see peering over the top of the iconostas an extraordinarily large icon of the Orthodox. So that would usually be go to monasteries or some churches, there may very well not be any icon in the middle if it's not the feast. It's just easy to remember. It takes a little bit of manpower to be moving things constantly.
Yeah.
So, that's why we don't do it.
Yeah, only originally, it was, I think the only thing was the village division seat.
Yep.
So even the cross on Saturday was off to the side. Yeah.
Oh, well, sure, because there's a lot of American sort of symbols.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, the right side of kind of reminds me of that, is like their little, like, area like has whatever feast day or something along like that, with that little space around. What's the major, you said the full figure one, so those are the only 4 full figure ones of those 4.
Yeah, we'll talk about the iconostas in a moment.
Okay.
So I'm mostly going to skip over that for now, but hold that question. I will say right in front of the iconostas, though, you'll notice there's a raised area. Does anyone know what that's called? With the steps up to it? There's a raised area right in front of the iconostas. It's part of it. No? It's called the ambo or ambon. Have you noticed, any of you, the difference between a Slavic style great entrance and a Byzantine style great entrance? So this church here does a Byzantine style great entrance. You're from a rural parish. What is the flight path, so to speak, of the great entrance in your parish? Yeah, so you go out the door and basically immediately to the front. And for those of you that have seen what we do in this parish, what is the flight path for our great entrance?
The whole area.
Yeah, well, so the reason for that, if you see some there's only a few examples of this love, but some very ancient churches have an ambon, a raised thing like that, except that it sticks out this way. So we see some remnants of that in the way we do our service. For example, where the bishop sits would have been the end of the ambon, end of the raised period thing. Also, where the epistle is read, right, is way the heck out here. That's because that would be the end of the ambon, the end of the raised area. So both of those practices are coming out the door and then going down the ambon. It's just the Byzantine have preserved the idea that it was rotated 90 degrees at one point in time. And the Slavs have updated the fact that it's not. But both have physically moved it. They've just, one of them has kept the liturgical action the same as it was before. Does that make sense? So that's where that difference is. You'll also see sometimes in Greek, actually I think most of the time in Greek parishes, they'll put the throne for the bishop way over there. It's the same thing, right? This is the end of the ambon, which now is over there because it's rotated 90 degrees. Whereas the Slavic style was in the middle of the church, which is where it was. It's rotated 90 degrees. So they've swapped different things about the space, which I find somewhat interesting.
That's not a callback to anything from the Jewish temple one, or where the bishop is?
I don't think so. Yeah, so I mostly just put this on the back as an interesting comparison, and we'll use the image of the Christian church in a second when we talk about the choirs. Because, like I said, I mean, this is similar to the continuation of the temple. So there are definitely some similarities. Direction of the album. Okay. So I want to talk for just a quick minute about the choir. Where's the choir here? Yeah, in the back. Except you might notice there's one lonely stand. Where is the one lonely stand?
Over here.
Yeah, way the heck up there. Why is that up there? Why is there one lonely stand in front? Where's the choir in your local parish? Okay, way up in front? Yeah. Okay. Is there a separate space, or is it just kind of clustered up in front? Yeah, so that's an American thing for the most part. I have a choir law. So if you look at this image on the back of the Orthodox church, you'll notice that it's in the shape of a cross, right? And you have, we talk about, there's the porch, the narthex, the nave, the iconostas, and the altar. So if you look at the total footprint, you have a cross. On either side, sticking out the wings of the cross, there are 2 little music stands and some seats sitting behind them. Those are the choirs. We don't have the ability to do that here, but sort of, again, remembering that is technically where the choirs are supposed to have the one stand up there, and we'll read the hours and stuff. Again, if you see, for example, Aphanite practice, they will have two choirs, which is pretty uncommon. I've seen it a few times here in America, but it's not at all common. And they sing lots of things antiphonally. So you may remember, if you've ever heard it said at the beginning of liturgy, we sing some antiphons. Those would have been sung back and forth between the two choirs. And there's a particularly interesting Aphanite practice where there's only one choir director. So he walks back and forth through the service to direct to one side and then back to the other, back and forth. And there are some things that he directs that all come down to middle. So, for example, a canon was traditionally done down in the middle, so the choirs would come together and sing together in the middle. You see this occasionally, the canon of St. Andrew in Lent, if you know that, is done with the choir out. It's not super common. I've seen it done in a few places where the choir comes down from that. That's another holdover from coming down from the two sides.
Holy Resurrection did that for that one feast day. They had one part over there, and like the one that was kind of like the more toned one was on the left.
Yeah,
the
and
right.
they had their main choir director, and yes, I think he did go back and forth for a few things, and you even saw he directed something from the middle. Yep, there is a little bit of a remnant of that sometimes, and it just really depends on the church. It's a lot, other than the fact that we occasionally do things antiphonally, we don't have anyone hiking back and forth through services. All right, any questions there? Let's go up and look at the iconostasis. So I talked before about the doors in the middle. Those are the beautiful gates. Yes. What is the purpose of this beautifully carved wall?
Separation dead, basically.
Sure. It has an entryway, right, very clearly in the middle, and two kind of hidden ones off to the side. Those are deacon doors off to the side. They can have either the icon of the archangels or of the deacons. When we were on mission, we had the deacons, and then when they put in the full iconostas, there was a vote, and they decided to put the archangels in. So then they didn't know what to do with the icons they had, but the deacons would just go to the side. So that's why we have both. Most parishes would not see that. It would be either the archangels or the deacons of the iconostas. You'll note every parish ever will have Christ and the Theotokos, and then depending on where the deacon doors are, the deacons and or archangels will float. In practice can vary a little bit, but in this case we have the icon of the patron saint of the parish, and then on the other side St. John. St. John will almost always be there. The Byzantine practice, I believe, swaps these two, so the parish saint would be on that side and St. John would be on the other side. And then after that, there are other things you may see. So it's not uncommon to have an icon somewhere on the iconostas for the saints of whatever land you're in. So you'll probably see in churches across the U.S. somewhere, if they have enough space, an icon of the saints of North America, or at least some of them. You may sometimes see, if there's really enough space, sometimes the person who donated the iconostas will have an icon of their choosing way at the end of one side or the other. There are a few kind of very loose rubrics, but it often comes down to the choice of the parish, what exactly goes on after pretty much what you see here. This is the standard of what the order may look like. Beyond this, how many of you have seen like super duper tall iconostases that have multiple ranks of icons? So there are some rules that define what rows on each row. The most common that most everywhere has is at least one up, which is usually the great feasts, although sometimes it's the If you have lots of icons, those 4 will be holding up the dome. Remember, the dome usually be the 4 corners holding up the dome. But of course, we don't have a dome. Questions?
Is there any, oh yeah, wait, for those 2 on the sides, is there any particular ones for those?
Sometimes you'll see like icons of angels serving somewhere, either here or in the altar. So sensing, holding things, usually obviously like that.
So you said those are common there. You're only choosing your preference?
No, the one on top, so those are usually either the great feasts, so it's not actually not what we have around, but you can look. So if we follow the liturgical year, starting in September, we have the Nativity of the Theotokos, Elevation of the Cross, Entry of the Theotokos in the Temple, the Nativity, the Theophany, entrance of presentation of Christ in the Temple, Annunciation, Palm Sunday, Resurrection, which seems always numbered, but I think they wanted to have it be equal number. And then Ascension, Transfiguration, and the Dormition of the Theotokos. So those are the 12 great feasts and Pascha. Like I said, sometimes those 12 great feasts are replaced with the 12 disciples.
And the,
Oh, yes. No, we don't have one. If we did, it would sort of replace these 2 lamps. It would be hanging down from the middle of the dome. Yeah, it's interesting they call it that. What it's most usually called, as far as I'm aware, is applied lamps.
is that supposed to represent the angel?
It has the disciples on the inside. No, sorry. It has the Old Testament prophets on the inside, and it has lights and the disciples on the outside. The light of Christ on the outside, so those that got to behold that, the disciples, and those who didn't on the inside. It doesn't always have icons. Sometimes it's just lights. In this case, they don't seem to be any lights on it, which I've not seen.
It's just like that.
Yeah.
Is there any reason why, because it, obviously, it seems the Gospels is going to be in order, but is there any reason why maybe Annunciation is the first one and the Nativity of the Theotokos is, and then the Exaltation of the Cross?
Well, so this follows the calendar year. So we start in September, and this is literally just going through the months of the year. That's how we order our church year. So, why don't we put Annunciation at the beginning of the church year is a good question. But I would argue that of the 2 characters in it, Gabriel would make sense to start at the beginning of him, and Theotokos it does. And that's an important part of the theology of the churches, the Theotokos, and why she's a big deal. So, and then you. Okay. So you can all come up. I will open the curtain for you and turn the lights on. So if you look, come. No, this way. So if you look at the back of your sheet, so they've got the holy place. Oh, they don't actually label it very well. I think it's the court altar. So what were the types of sacrifices that were done in the altar? Sorry, in the temple. Burnt offerings. sacrifices anymore, right? We do the bloodless sacrifice of Christ. So that's that same altar back there. And when we do the grave entrance, what are we doing? Does anyone know? Practically, physically, what are we doing? Yes, we're moving it between the two altars. Taking it from the table of oblation and putting it onto the big altar. Does anyone know why we go out and come back in? So historically, this altar, just like here, you'll note that it's actually outside of the holy place or the Holy Holies, right? So historically, and you can still see this in some cases, some burial churches, that table of oblation was out, like outside of our nave, outside. And sometimes even in a separate building. And so the great entrance was actually going all the way out to get it, and then coming back in, processing all the way back into the church with the child's discourse.
So like in the old temple, like when they do the sacrifices outside the temple?
No, they do the sacrifice, the blood sacrifice, but I'm saying it's outside the holy place. Of the holy
Yeah.
place. All right, so then if that's where we do the sacrifice, then what is the point of the table in the middle? What we usually refer to as the altar.
Is that basically the actual offering?
That's partially true. What else? So that's the throne. What was put into the Holy of Holies? Does anyone remember? Ark of the Covenant. And what is the Ark of the Covenant? Exactly. Presence descended upon the Holy of Holies, or on the Holy of Holies, specifically on the Ark of the Covenant. Right? So that's what we got. What was in the Ark of the Covenant? Aaron's rod that budded. If you think of the hymns that are sung for the Feast of the Cross, we talk about it being the new representation of Aaron's rod that budded. What else? That's on the outside. Yeah, what was on the inside? We have the two angels on the outside and the fans.
The Ten Commandments of
Yeah, the Ten Commandments of the law. We have the new law, right, in the gospel. What else? One more thing. What saved the people when they were walking through the wilderness?
Man.
Yes, the manna fell from heaven. So we do our service, right? But if someone gets sick during the week, we didn't have liturgy that day, what do we do? Well, in here, in this little miniature church, there's a small container that has the reserve sacrament. So if someone gets sick during the week, which will happen this Friday, there's a homebound member that I'll go visit. I'll take some out from here and go bring communion to them from that. So we have on the altar all of the things that were contained within the Holy of Holies. You may also notice we have a 7-branch candle stand, although it's oil lamps. And then so actually peek in for a second. We talked about the icons out there. What are the icons that are in here? Who are these people?
These look like the saints.
Well,
The church father?
for the most part.
Disciples up there, right?
There are disciples up there, that's true. Yes.
I was going to say that.
Specifically, these are, so it's not uncommon to just have hierarchs in general and priests icons in the altar. But specifically, these 4 are the ones whose liturgy we use. So St. James is sort of the prototype for the liturgies of St. John and Basil. So St. John is right there, and St. Basil is right here. And then during Lent, we do the pre-sanctified liturgy, which is usually attributed to St. Gregory the Theologian. So there you go. There's all 4 of those. You correctly noted the apostles. What are they doing? Can you tell?
They're receiving.
Yeah, something. What is something?
Right.
Communion, yeah. So in the early church, communion was received in 2 parts. The body and the blood were received separately. The clergy still commune that way, but we don't trust you all. So you get it together on a spoon so you can't do anything weird with it. Because people would take it and like throw it on their fields to try and get a better crop that year. And it's not magic, it doesn't work that way. He says take, eat, not take and throw on your field, right? So we don't give you the opportunity to do any of that. We put it directly in your mouth. But that's part of why we open. So does anyone know the very practical reason behind the opening and closing of the curtain? Why does that happen in services?
Just for you to prepare.
Sort of. That's pretty close.
Well, I think it's practical, so you're
each other, and there's, this is coming from cathedral, right? So there's assuming that you've got more than one or two priests. Then it takes a little while to greet each other, and the curtain is only open once they're all done and they're back and shaking the air over the gifts. The other time is right before communion, and yes, that's because that's when the clergy are receiving. Both of those times are towards the end of the service, when you're supposed to be focusing on the service, not on whatever we're doing over here, right? It's not important that you watch us say hello to each other, nor is it important that you watch us commune, right? There are canons that say we must commune. So there's no question about whether or not we are communing. We must, whether we're prepared or not. But there's no reason for you all to be focusing on that, especially at the very last second, right before you come forward to receive communion, right? You really should be focusing on your own preparations of that. So that's why we propose it, from a very, very practical reason. All right, so some of the other icons that you receive. Does anyone know what that thing is on the wall? In a little shadow box?
Is that a new theater?
No. Those that have seen Apostle Service have come up and venerated it, although not that particular one, but yeah. Say it louder. Yeah. Apitaphion is the Greek word, Plashenitsa is the Slavic word. That is taken out, is processed out on Holy Friday and left out on Holy Saturday in the middle of the church, the bier that we build out there. Every church has one that looks a little different, but it's placed out there, the gospel and cross are put out there. That's an old one. It's not in great condition, although it looks okay from here, but it's not in great condition, so it mostly just lives there because the other option is burning. So. And it's the one we used to use before we got here. All right, now what's all this in the back?
Jesus Christ, and that's kind of what you were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of ceilings. So we do have the icon of the Theotokos where she's supposed to be. It's just kind of small. And right below is a giant icon of Christ. Does anyone know why that is?
Who's the standing army?
That's very good, yeah. Anything else? So we call this the high place. In many churches, although not this one, there's actually another step up here to get to it. Why are we here? What is the purpose of our services? Remember?
Right.
Yeah, worship God, right? Not just like nebulously, but we have His throne in the altar, and we have Him at the high place, right? You will see when people cross the middle point of the church, it's not uncommon for people to either turn and bow, or at least to cross themselves, right? Because we're crossing the high place, the icon of Christ. That's also why we don't stand in the very middle of the church. One, it's just nice to keep an alleyway, but two, we stand off to the side. If you wanted to come down and go out, you would go straight down unimpeded, right? If a bishop is serving, you can see maybe there's a chair in the middle. That's where the bishop sits. You'll note that when a priest is serving, when we sit off to the side. Only the bishop gets to sit directly in the middle. Alright. Any other questions about this area?
So why is the Theotokos on the top then?
Because on a larger church, she would be kind of peering out over the top of the ikonostas.
The theological reason why she would be on top anyways, and like Christ would be coming
Oh, I
forward.
see. Okay. So Christ is on top, right? In that, if you look at the back, you've got the dome with Christ on
in the
top.
image with Theotokos.
So he's at the sort of highest point of both axes. You have this axis, right? So he's at the front of that, and you have this axis, and he's at the highest point of that. So in both cases, Christ is at the front. But the Theotokos always goes in sort of the next spot. So, on the doors, right, that you're standing in front of, you have Christ and immediately next to the Theotokos. So you have Christ immediately below him, the Theotokos. It just so happens that puts her above this axis. But that's it wouldn't look quite like that in a normal church because she would be like way up there. And this icon would be much lower.
Is that two of the apostles on the left and the right?
Yeah, these are Peter and Paul. Thoughts, Sister Paul?
The pillars of the church.
Other questions?
And if during the services, I seen the cross gets turned, so why isn't that also happening?
Why do we cross Gospels
Yeah.
or change the direction of this.
Yeah,
So, actually, this should be changed. So, our gospel has on the one side, in the middle, Christ on the cross, and on the other side, the resurrection. So we flip it to the resurrection on the days that it's the resurrection, so Sunday. And on every other day, we put it with the cross up. And this is the same too. If you look here in the middle, you have Christ crucified, and on the other side, you have him resurrected. I don't know how well you can see from over there, but that's what that is. The Slavs don't tend to necessarily have things that do that. It's not as much their practice. But we have a Byzantine gospel for a reason I don't fully understand. So we flip all the things to match.
And the 7-candle thing, that goes back to like the Jewish tradition. What is it called?
The 7-branch candlestick?
Yeah.
We just call it that. Also note, we just had the feast of the Nativity of St. John. And do you remember in the gospel reading, those of you who went to that service, it talks about his dad, Zacharias, the elder Zacharias. What did he do? What was he doing in the temple when the angel came to him?
He was serving as
Yes? Slightly more specifically than that. He was specifically doing the offering of incense. So we have one of our censers here because we use the censer's part of the table of oblation and the preparation for liturgy on this side. The other one lives just on the other side of that curtain. That's the one with the bells that we use for joyous things. Because we use a lot of incense in all of our services, right? I'm sure you've noticed, other than when I physically can't be in multiple places at once. Every other service that we do has incense at some point in it. There's actually a prophecy in Malachi that says that incense will be offered everywhere.
To the Gentiles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Gentiles will offer
What's
incense.
in other words, is a prophecy of the church, there would be incense offered. And it's,
We talk about that a little bit more when we get there in our Yeah, it's interesting, right?
yeah,
A new thing.
that blew my mind when I was like, well, where are they doing incense at?
Any other questions about the things in this space or anything like that?
is there any reason why you had the one, like for the instance, the censer with the bells and without bells?
Why we have two?
Yeah.
More festive have bells on it than not. So during Lent we switched to the one without bells. Some places, the really Slavic way, which not very many places do, is to only use the censer with bells during Pascha and Apostoltide, and the rest of the year to use the one without. The sort of middling Slavic style is to use bells for feasts and Sundays and Paschal, and no bells for weekday services. And the Greeks just kind of do that. I don't know. For bells.
And then all those are the icons that are being blessed.
People give icons or crosses or other things to be blessed.
Yeah, cross.
Oh, yeah.
And then the angels that are also supposed to call back to the Ark of the Covenant, like those are also
Part
part
of it.
from.
Yeah, also, I mean, we bring them out, right?
Yeah.
And fan the gifts. entire space as the altar. So if people say, hey, you go, so something I'm going to pop my head into the altar. That does not mean that they're shoving their head into the table, right? It means they're just going to, off through the door. So we call this whole space the altar. But properly speaking, that's just a table. But we call the space that contains the same thing. Just to be confusing, especially if people talk about going to the altar. Or serving the altar. And did you see what I did when I entered the space? 3 prostrations. And then I got rid of the table, which you probably didn't see. Yeah, so other than Sundays, when we go to prostrations, entering the altar, we do prostrations before it. And we need a blessing to be in there. So who can go into this altar space?
The altar boys. And also the reader. I've seen the reader go in there for the Bible.
Oh, you're talking about for the epistle.
Yeah.
Wrong.
Please.
Correct. Correct. That's disputed.
And
That's
anyone
why
the priest blessing to be in there? Anyone that you bless to be in there?
There you go. That is the problem. Anyone who's blessed to be in. So you will see women go to the altar sometimes, most frequently for like cleaning or whatever. But if you go into a women's monastery, who serves at the altar? The women, because that's all there, and the singular priest, right? And who do they get a blessing from to enter the altar space?
Priest.
Not the priest.
Abbess.
The abbess. So you'll see at the beginning of liturgy in a women's monastery that everyone goes and gets a blessing from the abbess to enter the altar, including any women that are going to serve in the altar.
But if they were going to do communion, that it would be a priest there.
Yes, in order to do liturgy. So does anyone know why that whole only men can go on the altar thing came about?
Does it have something to do with the, I don't know, menstrual cycle or something?
No. No, if anyone has ever tried to tell you that, they are very wrong.
Okay, I don't know.
We do not have a concept of ritual purity. That is, if you were Jews, then yes, your time of flow would not be allowed to enter the temple. We don't do that, right? Women are allowed in all the time. Our modern products are very good at making sure you're not just bleeding everywhere, so that's really a problem. Regardless, though.
Well, I know, the reason why I said it, because you said it's the blood of sacrifice houses. Yes.
Yeah, if a priest cuts himself, then that's
If you
one
said
thing.
if you cut yourself before you can.
This is just my own thought. I've never read anything definitive on this, but both in Byzantine and Slavic lands, they went through various, one much longer than the other, but still periods of intense persecution, and a lot of the liturgical vibrancy died off. So with the Turks in the Byzantine Empire, right, all of these multiple liturgies were basically condensed down into the 3 or 4-ish that we celebrate today. There were probably more that were done before. Well, we know there were more that were done before that, but other than their name and some little fragments here and there, we don't have any surviving practice of doing that. Things like deaconesses, right? Almost completely fallen out of use, not entirely, but almost completely fallen out of use. I suspect that during those periods of very intense persecution, some sort of default rules fell into place just because they were trying to keep things going and because they didn't necessarily have a lot of education about church stuff because that wasn't really allowed. And so it's sort of like the minimum safest thing you can do became not just the rule but the law. And so for
400.
Yeah, 4th century.
400.
Yeah. He served with Dionysus. So, pretty early in the church, we have that. But yes, if you look at some of the very, very early ones, the altar had pillars and a cloth to be drawn around just the altar table. Now we keep the whole space.
But I seem to make like the very like, earlier ones, like when I was in Rome, they didn't have the full one, but there was still like an original, at least like some separation.
Yes.
So like, is that also just again like, because it's separated, like, that's the holy space back there, and then later it became, once everything got more like, I guess, more widespread, where you can actually have the full official one, and like, okay, we'll put an actual, that like iconostasis.
No, there was some debate about how to do it, and actually, I'm blanking on the name of the saint, but it was practiced maybe in Alexandria of having the altar in the very middle of the church, and thus you have people all around it. So there was some variation in the layout of the church. This has become the standard now. I'm not aware of any church built any differently than this, but yeah, it was fairly, like I said, the first 200 years that this became really the standard everywhere.
Well, I guess what I know is what led to that becoming the standard, like what led to that tradition be fully adopted.
I don't know that I have a good answer for that off the top of my head. If I had to take a wild stab, I'd say probably it was easier when you're dealing with persecution in an underground church to have a little table that's covered, and once you start being able to do a full church building, it's just nicer to have a larger covering. So, I do want to, actually, one more thing I want to highlight about the iconostas. So it is thought of as a divider, and that's sort of true. But in liturgy, what happens? What does the priest do with the chalice when people go to receive communion? It starts on the table, and then what? Comes out, right? Jesus comes out and down to people, right? Just like so the way that the fathers talk about this is not so much as a divide, but more as a focusing point, right? You, rather than seeing all of the whatever random things happening back there, you instead have something that kind of narrows where you're looking, which is the important place. And again, I think that's why the practicality of closing the curtain at the time when we're shuffling around, because it's not important, and it's not what you're supposed to be paying attention to. So when we're focusing on something that's not helpful, we just cover it. The rest of the time, right, it's focusing your attention onto what's happening in the middle. Just where all the action is.
Flowers are mandatory?
No, they're common, especially around feast days. This parish does them all the time, which is a little less common, but it's just sort of a nice expression that some of the parishioners here like, and I don't want to take it away from them.
Leaves always got a nice feeling. You look at everything, like everything has a purpose. It's not just ornateness or just like beauty to it. Like there's a very specific purpose for everything.
Speaking of, why does the priest face away from you all?
Because you're worshiping with us. You're like leading the pack basically.
Sure.
Or leading the congregation.
Yep, that's all good. Also, you may have noticed that on bishops and sometimes on priests, there's icons at the back of the vestment, right? And in the Slavic style, you've, I'm sure, seen the vestments go up, which makes it hard to see. Makes it hard to see who the actual person of the priest is, right? You can see that there is someone standing there serving in the role of priest, but you don't necessarily have any indication as to who that person is. That's because it doesn't really matter, right? We are all of us, including me, the priest, are worshiping together, worshiping God at the high place. That's why he's the one looking back, not me. And similarly, I don't really matter, right? I am just the person standing there. But you're not here because of me, right? No one is coming to see Father Damian walk around in some weird robes, right? You're here to worship God. So it could be anyone standing there. And it's the same service, right?
As seen too, not related to the structures, but they're in a liturgy as well. Why is it, when either it's the bishop or, I think you said like in Slavic and the Byzantine ones, like they have cap, that's just a honorary thing, but why doesn't they take it off when they are reading the gospel though?
Oh, hats.
Yeah.
Just out of respect, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I guess not a big one, not a big theological reason why. I thought it was gonna be,
Kind of, but
I was gonna have to do something with like the fanning too, like they're covered as well, and it's like an acting ability that they take it off, which I guess is the respect thing.
yeah, no, it's really just a, just coming back to not wearing hats during that.
Online it says the Orthodox prayer for the East. Is this church template or is that like not a thing?
I mean, it is when you build your own building,
Okay.
when you have to just take whatever space you can get, faces whatever direction you have to face. Yeah, east is like somewhere over there.
Okay.
So,
It's not like
it would be
absolutely.
very hard to make our church in this building face that way. Yes, if we were to build our own, it would absolutely face east, no question. And pretty much, I mean, the other way to say it is, every church you've ever been in is built to be an Orthodox church, faces east.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Anyone that's in it.
Also, if you have an icon room in your house, it should face east, right?
Yeah, at least as best as you can. I mean,
Yeah,
it may not be super possible, I mean,
Yeah, right.
anything, but at least as much towards the east as you can.
What was the reason again for the east direction
What direction
That's
was
the
the
last
last
one,
one?
of the east, so that,
What does this represent?
The cloths? They're fancy. I mean, so we clothe the church, with the different colors of the year. So, right, we'll see changes as gold right now, which is our default. But during the feast of Pentecost or any feast of the Holy Spirit, we put green in here. Green, the color of life. For any feast of a martyr, we put red. For any feast of the Theotokos or Virgin, we do blue.
I love that blue vest.
Or-
that blue, that's, yeah, that is beautiful.
Lent, Sundays in Lent, we do a bright